screen here, which is notes for today. I'm not doing my emails or anything like that. I am trying to direct the guys. But without further ado, I'm just going to introduce first Christian, I think.
Hi, thank you, Magnus. Thank you for an introduction. I'm Christian Calvillo. I am a research associate at the Center for Energy Policy, which is in the University of Strathclyde. A little bit of background: I am an engineer by education. I did my undergrad and my master's on mechatronics and electronic systems, respectively, in Mexico. Then I moved to Spain to do my PhD on energy system modeling, smart cities, distributed energy resources, energy markets. It was a little bit of everything, but all around the idea of smart grids, smart systems, renewable systems, and distributed resources. And then I moved to Glasgow for this position on energy policy and energy efficiency. I was looking into first, and then we transitioned a bit to electric vehicles. I'm working now on a project on CO2 transport and storage for industry decarbonization. So in the center where we are, we do a little bit of everything, all around the energy transition and all about making that transition fair and just for everyone. So yeah, I think that's me.
Sorry, thank you. Ian, I think you're next on my screen.
So good evening, everybody. My name is Ian Phillips. An awful long time ago, I did a degree in civil engineering, loved the degree, hated being a civil engineer. So I actually switched direction and went into computing, but I happened to go into computing with Shell, and I ended up spending a couple of years offshore learning about their main user department, a group called Petroleum Engineering, and I loved it. I'd found what I wanted to do. So I actually went back to university to Heriot-Watt and did the master's degree in petroleum engineering as a one-year conversion. And I've spent much of my career working in the oil and gas industry, some of them for big oil companies like Shell and BP, also for small oil companies and a little outfit called Ramco. And unusually, perhaps, I spent a bit of time in the service sector working for Halliburton. But in 2007, myself and 3 colleagues set up a business called CO2 Deep Store, which was set up to try and provide the commercial service of disposing of carbon dioxide. At the time, the big focus for CCS was on power stations. After about 6 years of beating our head against that brick wall, the government finally gave up on the idea, and as a result, our business was going nowhere. So we set up a company called Pale Blue Dot Energy, initially as an energy transition consulting business. I personally left and I spent 6 years working for an organization called the Oil and Gas Innovation Center. And about 18 months ago, I rejoined Pale Blue Dot as the director of something called the Acorn Project. Acorn is physically located about 50 kilometers north of Aberdeen at the gas terminal at St. Fergus. And our plan is to actually build 2 projects. One will probably be the UK's first carbon capture project, where we will capture carbon dioxide on site from a couple of gas turbines and some process equipment, and we will pump it offshore and bury it a couple of kilometers underground in an old gas reservoir, used to be called the Goldeneye gas field. In addition to that project, sort of next door, we will be building what may well be one of the UK's first so-called blue hydrogen projects, manufacturing low carbon hydrogen from natural gas and starting the process of decarbonizing the natural gas system. So that's what I do for a day job, and I love it. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Next up is Luca.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Always hard to follow Ian, but I'm trying to step into that enthusiasm. I also love what I do. I work for the OGTC, which is a technology center, which is co-funded by the 2 governments, the UK and Scotland, and industry, and is focused on technology driving transition. So we're trying to accelerate the development of technology that can take the oil and gas industry into a net zero energy system, and also integrating with the renewables, with the carbon capture and storage, and with the hydrogen, both blue and green. And the Innovation Network Director, which is a fancy title to say that basically I lead our horizon scanning activity, trying to understand the trends, both in society and technology, and how those trends will impact the industry and the region, and therefore what can we do from a technology development, what are the priorities, where should we focus in order to make that transition happening. I come to that role after 20 years of consulting. I was at Accenture, Andersen Consulting before that. I'm not an engineer. I actually studied economics, but always had a passion for science and for economics as well. I think those two are kind of two engines of progress, and when they work together is also very, very fascinating. And I've been a consultant mainly in change management, introducing new technology into organization, mainly for the oil and gas industry, and pretty much around the world, and ended up finally in London and then Aberdeen 12 years ago, and this is now home, and here I am.
Great, thanks, Luca. And then finally on the panel we have Mark.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Gowdy. I'm an old University of Strathclyde alumnus, studied electrical and mechanical engineering back in the days, went into consulting and worked across the energy spectrum, looking at everything from electrical systems to connecting offshore wind farms, through to the remediation and extension of life of oil and gas assets, through to nuclear power and energy storage, finally settling on hydrogen. Having had that kind of consultancy experience, going across all the different aspects of the energy spectrum, both here in the UK and abroad, moved across and joined SP Energy Networks as their distribution system operation manager. For those of you who don't know who SP Energy Networks are, if you're in the central or southern Scotland, it's most likely that they are supplying the electricity to your premises at the moment. But they also cover electricity supply to through the cables and wires that they operate as a business for Northern Wales, Merseyside, Cheshire and Northern Shropshire. For me as a role as a distribution system operation manager, I'm looking at the future of the electrical system and how we become more active in terms of managing future demands such as electric vehicles and heat pumps. I'm an engineer, and it's, for me, engineering is a kind of a lifelong commitment, not just for Christmas, I think, at this point. And very passionate about education, giving back, and chair a number of schemes across the UK. So I chair the IET's financial hardship scheme called the Engineering Horizons Bursary, and I'm a non-executive director for the Glasgow Science Centre. So that's pretty much me in a nutshell, Magnus.
That's great. So hopefully everyone's got a little bit of a feeling for who's on the panel, what all of our backgrounds are. I'm going to start off the first sort of session, which is the short-term transition session. So we'll be looking around, firstly, what the policy is that specifically the Scottish Government has set, and I'll be leaning on Christian for that. Hopefully he'll be able to set the scene there. And then we'll let the panel dive into the challenges that the policy presents us with, and what opportunities might be there as well. So I guess, Christian, could you perhaps just give the audience a very short sort of high-level snippet of what have we got to do between now and 2030 from an energy transition point of view, and particularly sort of thinking around things like electrification of vehicles, generation of energy from clean sources, and also things like the heating of our buildings. How do we change that as well?
Okay, thank you, Magnus. I'll do my best. It's a big challenge. So yeah, the answer to the question, what needs to happen from now to 2030? It's a lot of things. Just to set up a little bit of the scene, the last December, the updated climate change plan came out. The Scottish Government climate change plan came out, which set up the update targets of everything, let's say, from now to 2032. It has been revised because new developments, because the original document came out in 2018. And the new targets, I think there are two important ones, is there is an expectation to reduce CO2 emissions by 75% relative to 1990 levels by 2032, sorry. And which is a lot, it sounds not as bad as the net zero by 2045, but this in practice is a lot harder than the second one. So this will be harder, and if you don't get this one, it's very likely that you won't get the other. And the other big target is from all energy used in Scotland, 50% has to comes from low carbon or renewable sources. And that's not only electricity, that's transport, and that's heat. And that's the big challenge as well. Thinking a bit about sectors, the electricity sector is actually doing relatively well. It was the low-hanging fruit. At this point in time, it's almost well decarbonized with around 90% of electricity generation coming from renewables or low carbon sources. However, the challenge will be how everything else electrifies. That demand will increase. That will require more generation, and that will require more security of supply, which is also a concern that maybe Mark will describe with a little bit more detail. The other question mark here is the role of hydrogen in the whole thing. There are two documents coming out in this year, actually. One is the revised energy strategy, and the second is the hydrogen action plan. So those are very important to keep an eye out for. So that's electricity. Buildings, the biggest challenge, in my opinion. The target, as I said, is to decarbonize everything. There was one, I'm trying to find it. By 2030, at least 50% of Scotland's building stock is heated using zero emission systems. It sounds difficult, and the statistics here says that you need to be shifting the heating of all household, like around 100,000 per year. Like right now, it's like a handful in comparison. So you need to increase it by 10-fold to 20-fold the amount of decarbonization. So that's a big one. And on the transport side of things, there is a big push on electric vehicles. We know there is a target on banning new sales of conventional cars and bans petrol and diesel by 2032. I personally don't think that will be the hardest thing to do, but it's still a challenge. But still, the condition needs to be there. Charging points is one of the things that complicates stuff, especially for those that don't have of strict parking. Other things on transport, a big push on active travel and buses, public transport. And last but not least, industry. Industry is a key challenge here as well. It's difficult in the sense that you need to do it well, or you will lose jobs, or you will lose industries. And industry is a big part of Scotland's economy, and you want to keep those jobs because they are good jobs, they're well-paid jobs, and they keep the economy thriving. So you need to maintain those jobs, create new, help people transition, and don't let companies to go overseas. It sounds a lot easier than it actually is, but there is a big push from the government to try to manage that. And I'm sure Luca and Ian will mention this as well. So this is a very, very brief overview, but I can go into more detail if needed.
Yeah, no, that's really good, Christian. I think you've highlighted that this is an immense challenge, really. I think 75% reduction of CO2 emissions from 1990 levels is massive. I think there was a study came out that the UK was ahead of the rest of the top economies in the world on reducing that to, I think, sitting about 45%. Someone might be able to give a better number than that, but I think that was the number I read. So there's still a long way to go between now and was it 2032? And there's massive challenges on both the supply and the demand side, and like you say, security of supply. I wonder, I'm going to bring in Mark here, just around the electrification of vehicles, and that's an immense challenge to be able to have sort of electrified transport and to ensure that everyone has access to that, not just the richest in society, but also those who are less fortunate as well?
So from my perspective, there's kind of two challenges. That's from the way that we consume energy through the form of electricity. So conventionally, you have your white goods in your home, you might have electric heating if you're maybe in a more urban area, and that kind of characterizes the normal electrical demand that you would expect to see. Adding an electric vehicle to individual properties could increase that by 100%. Add that and a heat pump, that could be a 200% increase for that individual property demand. And that creates two challenges. One is that there's a big push to keep prices low in terms of the cost to the consumer of energy. At the same time, giving them what's called freedom to consume. That's the idea where if this is a product, I'm going to badge them as a net zero product, is that by purchasing this off the shelf, you're essentially buying a product that will not emit the same level of emissions as its alternative. You've seen great strides with that with energy efficiency products. You can't buy high wattage bulbs anymore. You can't buy high wattage white goods. And that's had a manifest impact on UK demand. And those commodities have to be supported. So if you as an individual want to make that choice, then the electrical system has to be able to accommodate that choice. And that means investment, it means capacity, and it means new ways of working. Now, we tend to look at the transition as a challenge, and it's huge. I mean, not to kind of beat around the bush, there are large swathes of our economy and society that need to be decarbonized, but with every challenge, there is huge opportunity. And what we're reflecting on here today is that for kind of these graduates and trainees are considering a future in this sector, is that if you're looking at net zero products, if you want to assist with the development of battery or automotive systems, motors that are driving that kind of automotive decarbonization, if you want to get involved in the kind of supply chain for heat pumps, and I'm sure as our colleagues kind of get on to talking about hydrogen, that's a repurposing and refocusing of a sector that is huge in terms of its asset base. So there's that opportunity with the kind of net zero products, but they need to be installed. So there's a huge amount of infrastructure that has to go in place, charging points, the heat pumps themselves need to be installed. So there's kind of two major opportunities, one end in terms of the products that help people make net zero carbon choice, also the infrastructure that makes those choices a reality. So there's two very big opportunities here in terms of jobs, opportunities, and things that we need to address.
Yeah, it's a very well put that there is opportunities there as well with these challenges. Ian, I think it's probably a good point to bring you in on the hydrogen and perhaps also the carbon capture world, and what role is there for existing oil and gas assets is one question I would have to help to decarbonize the natural grid, and also how do we make a transition from natural gas to blue hydrogen and then finally into green hydrogen as well?
So you want me to solve world hunger at the same time? So if I could just add something to perhaps add a little bit of colour to particularly what Mark was saying. Scotland consumes about nearly 160 terawatt hours of energy each year. About half of it goes on heating, about a quarter on transport, and the other quarter on general electrical use. And when you're talking about decarbonising that, you have to remember that something like 80+% of our energy actually still comes from hydrocarbons. So it's emitting CO2. So if, for example, we were to try and replace half of that with wind, you're talking about something like 50 or 60 of the biggest wind farms we've ever installed offshore the UK to deliver that sort of energy. Now, I do absolutely agree with Mark that the total will come down. We'll have to find ways to be more efficient on transport, on heating and so on, but it still gives you an indication of the massive scale of the problem. I think the role of oil and gas is already cemented into how we live. We are accustomed to driving places, to going on trains and planes to get around. We're accustomed to flicking the switch and the lights coming on. all of that is delivered by a whole energy system, which is underpinned by the flexibility of oil and gas, which is very convenient. It's very energy dense. You know, you get a tank full of petrol in your car, you can probably drive 500 or 600 miles. So all of that convenience we're trying to replace with something that doesn't emit carbon. And I think that particularly as we're trying to do this at an enormous pace, 9 years from now, we want to have 75% less emissions. Wow. Now, the opportunities that exist specifically in hydrogen, I mentioned briefly that my company is looking to develop blue hydrogen. So that involves a fairly sizable piece of chemical plant to convert the methane that is natural gas into hydrogen, which is the thing we can consume, and when we burn it, the byproduct is just water. But the other half of the story is carbon dioxide. You capture the carbon dioxide and then you need to put it somewhere so it doesn't go in the atmosphere. And that brings us to the concept of CCS, carbon capture and storage. And that's when I described, so we'll pipe the CO2 offshore, we will put it down well bores, same sort of technology the oil and gas industry uses, and we will store it in porous rocks, which are a couple of kilometers underground. And the idea is essentially we put it there and it never comes out. So we've removed it from the atmospheric system. Now, ultimately, if we're still trying to do that in 50 years' time, we've missed the point. We need to transition to a much lower carbon way of generating our energy. But the problem is now, the climate's not getting any cooler. We're already seeing the sort of impacts. So we really have to do something now. And I see both blue hydrogen and CCS as very powerful transition tools. Certainly anybody on this call, in the duration of your career, you'll see multiple such systems be installed to achieve the dramatic reductions in carbon emissions that we need. But in parallel, I can see big developments in wind, big developments in energy efficiency that will eventually replace much of that hydrocarbon production. And in the particular context of hydrogen, I think the blue hydrogen gives us a source of big volume of a gaseous energy, hydrogen, that we can use now. Over time, I think that will be supplemented and eventually replaced by green hydrogen, so hydrogen produced by electrolysis from wind turbines. The technology isn't really there right now to do that electrolysis at the sort of scale we need, hence the need for this transition idea.
Yes, certainly from my experience, I'm involved in a few European projects. In one particularly is one called Periscope, and as part of Periscope, I went to Groningen in the Netherlands to look at their hydrogen network that they were developing using offshore wind and electrolysis, and it's very much not there today on large scale, and it will take a long time. I think Luca, when we spoke by email, you said this is a transition, not a switch. And I guess for yourself in the OGTC, what's the role for oil and gas in the next 10 years, and what things do you see? Obviously, Ian's touched on on carbon capture storage, and there's obviously parallels with the industry there. But I guess on other elements, I'm thinking around exploration, development, and production of oil and gas facilities using clean energy sources and these kinds of things.
Yeah, there are many angles. I think I'll start from this is a transition, not a switch, but at the same time, I'd like to inject some optimism because we heard that this is a challenge in energy. It is a challenge, and the Committee on Climate Change 6 carbon budget, basically none of their scenario is hitting for Scotland the 75% reduction by 2030, but it does by 2045. So maybe there's a time adjustment there. One important element I think to reflect on is that we are used, as Ian mentioned, to a system which is based on hydrocarbon. And hydrocarbon is and has been so far the predominant energy source. We need to think that we're moving to a context in an energy system where there isn't a single dominant energy source for a long time. There will be wind, solar, geothermal, and other, oil, gas, and etc. And that will be different region by region based on the natural characteristic and natural resources. For Scotland, clearly a lot is offshore wind, onshore wind already, but offshore wind as well. Plus tidal, of course, but they are still emerging in a way, not as mature and ready. That said, the electrification of the system, which is required, required basically we double the amount of electricity produced by 2050. And that means, as Ian said, that when we look at hydrogen, we have to do blue hydrogen for a while. Because green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, they're not really in competition at the moment. They will be in competition by 2040, 2050. At the moment, the green hydrogen, or if you want, producing hydrogen from dedicated renewable sources, is actually in competition with the providing electricity to the grid. And so installing a wind farm for producing hydrogen at the moment is non-economical and a nonsense from an economic perspective. You better produce install a wind farm to produce electricity from the grid. And that's where the role of the oil and gas industry is important, because in a way, for Scotland, it will go down. So it is already a mature basin, and it will decline because of that and because of the energy transition. But that will take time, and in the meantime, that oil and gas industry is a formidable platform, in my view, to build the new energy system, the net zero energy system. It's about the infrastructure, but it's about what is called the innovation system, which is made of capital, it's made of knowledge, it's made of innovation centers, it's made of academia and research organization, it's made of skills and workforce. And that is what can be leveraged to build a new energy system, which is based on renewables, offshore wind, the predominant one, and offshore floating wind, the new and emerging one, and on hydrogen CCS. And hydrogen is particularly important for storage, because all that electricity, the grid doesn't store energy, it just moves it around. And so the fluctuation that we have in demand from day and night and seasonality is big, especially season, right? So hydrogen is inefficient, because if you produce electricity, you better put the electricity in a battery and use it than to put into a molecule and then transform that molecule into electricity again, just thermodynamics. But it is a formidable potential battery. I see hydrogen as a potential big battery and something that can be transported, not always easily, but it can. And then CCS, because we still need to have some oil and gas into the system, and especially some gas. So again, the Committee on Climate Change sees a reduction of 80% of the oil demand in the UK. Basically, is only left something for air or aviation fuel, and of 70% reduction in gas, which is mainly for power generation with associated CCS, because the gas provides that flexibility to ramp up and down quickly based on the demand. But the CCS is needed to make it net zero, or to make it very, very low carbon. But CCS is also important for industry, because industrial production is very hard to decarbonize, especially heavy industry, petrochemical, cement, and steel. And that's where the combination of fuel switching, so replacing gas as a fuel with hydrogen, and hydrogen again is blue with CCS, or capturing the emissions from the factory to maintain the industry. Because you mentioned, I think at the beginning, right? So the UK reduced by 40% their emission since the 90s. But that 40% is actually calculated as the emissions generated in the UK. So by closing a factory, closing a steel plant, and importing the steel from China, you reduce the carbon footprint. That's the irony in it. That's what Greta Thunberg called, creative accounting. So it's very hard to measure the consumer carbon footprint, but it can be estimated around, that we have reduced maybe by 10, 11%, more or less, not by 40, by replacing energy with wind and by offshoring. So we need not to offshore industry. We need to keep the industry here, keeping it competitive and keeping it green, which is why carbon capture and hydrogen are extremely important and are part of the future of Scotland and part of that transition from oil and gas to that. And that's just one element of, I started saying, is important. I'm optimist because we tend, that was Bill Gates saying that we tend to overestimate what can be done in 2 years and underestimate what can be done in 10 years. And we talk about 2030, which is 10 years. Just a few years ago, I think 2016, the International Energy Agency, I think forecasted that by 2070, we will still be relying and using heavily on the internal combustion engine cars. And now we have announcement by all the major manufacturers that they're not going to produce, new vehicles, internal combustion, but only hybrid electric or hydrogen, but in the 30s. So that's the importance of the exponential growth or the tipping point, where at some point the technology and the change become a landslide. It's hard in the beginning, but then they become a landslide. And even the infrastructure that Mark mentioned, we are adding hundreds of thousands of demand to the grid with electric vehicles. But there is also new technology, called vehicle to grid, and associated with smart meters. That means that all these vehicles where we're not running them are batteries. So distributed batteries that can store that energy. So yes, there will be more demand to charge the vehicles, but at the same time, those vehicles can become part of the system, which needs to be a smart system. And that's the next element, the final element of this is the digital technology that is going to be super important to manage this complex and diverse energy system.
Yeah, lots of valuable points. Christian, I just want to bring you back in where you haven't spoken for a little while. I guess the panel has discussed lots of different things. What are the key things that worry you in your day-to-day job from a policy point of view, and what impact it's going to have on our society?
Well, there are lots of things. I think that were very good points all across the table. So I thank you for that. I guess the big worry is always and always has been the public acceptance and the public being just on the transition, let's say, making sure that some people don't overpay for the benefit or for the challenge ahead of us. And that's unfortunately has happened, and unfortunately, if we don't do it properly, it can still happen. Examples has been, for instance, the feed-in tariffs with PVs, with solar photovoltaics. You put a solar photovoltaics in your house, and you get a rebate. You get money back from your supplier, which is great because it promotes the technology and people take it and say, well, it's great, I'm saving some money. But the problem with that is that it's part of that tariff that you were paying for supporting the network and maintaining the network for everyone, because we all pay for the network. You're paying less of that. So that extra cost goes to other people that don't have the photovoltaics. So that example, the same is very likely to happen with electric vehicles if we're not careful. Right now, we're subsidizing people getting electric vehicles, which are the rich people. Like, I don't have an electric vehicle. Lots of people don't have an electric vehicle because they're still expensive, and that's the reality. And lots of people don't have the money to buy new cars. They just buy secondhand. And at this point, it's still very difficult to find a secondhand electric vehicle. If you live in a flat, you might not get a charging point, so that also stops you for having an electric vehicle. Same happens with heat pumps. You might want to change, but you might not have the capital to invest. Even though they are cost effective, even though you would save money in the long run, you still need to get £10,000 right now, or 15 or 20, I don't know, depending on your circumstances, to do this. So there are all the technologies there. There are lots of goodwill, but it's very difficult to do it if you don't have the capital and if you don't have access to things. And then there's another important point there, and it's about the skills that were mentioned earlier. Someone needs to install that heat pump. Very recently, about policies, again, going back to policies, there's these green grants from the government in across, I think it was England and Wales. I don't think they applied to Scotland, but as an example, I think they put forward £500 million for these green grants, and they were only taken a few thousands because many of the builders weren't get paid on time, so they were a bit hesitant of getting new jobs. There were not so many people that were licensed to do this in this scheme, so they were eligible to get to these grants. So it was a lot of barriers there on policy to get access to that finance that will allow this thing to happen. So yeah, lots of things. Sorry, I'm not sure if I make much more sense, but I hope I did.
No, you definitely do. So I'm just sort of looking at the clock, and I do want to look at and dive into sort of the 2050 and the bigger picture, because I guess you know, there's lots of young folks on the call who have got 30-40 years of work in them yet. So I guess that there might be some interest in knowing what you know, the skills and the education you're going through at the moment. How is that transferable into what would be green hydrogen, or what would be a completely carbon neutral society, and what opportunities are out there? And I think again, Christian, just if you could just maybe give us sort of a few examples on the policies of 2050 and what we're working towards.
The short answer is there are no clear policies as now for that long in the future. Most of the policies that are on place now, they're more up to 2032. However, and I think we have clear signals on where things are moving towards. One of those things are CCS, the repurposing oil and gas. I think that's a clear signal from the government, and that could be, as I said, CCS or hydrogen. I think the Scottish government wants to be a leader on those two areas. Following a little bit as well on the example of Norway. Norway is doing very well on the CCS front. Other important thing, maybe more across the UK, that they're really expecting a big role on BECCS, bioenergy and CCS, as a way of creating negative emissions. That's another big thing. And one last thing that we always tend to forget and oversee is forestry and land use. Is very important. We tend to not focus so much on that because it's not technology. However, there's a big push on it, and it will be key to achieve net zero across the UK, not only in Scotland, but here there's a massive targets on recover peatlands and recover forests. So people that have any inclination on those areas, I think they will get lots of jobs, lots of work.
Ian, I saw towards the end of the last session you popped your hand up, and maybe you could just sort of touch more on the hydrogen side and what does it mean for green hydrogen? What things have to happen for us to move into that?
I think I'd say two things. In answer to the specific question about skills, actually it's the sort of skills that people are learning in universities right now. It's mechanical engineering, it's electrical engineering, it's process engineering. Just happens the fluid's a bit different. So to give you an example, in CCS, it's basically a big chemical plant, it's amine plants, it's stuff we've been doing for years. The big difference is that the fluid, the dominant fluid is CO2. So instead of the risk being a leak and a fire, the risk is a leak and a massive bit of very cold, because you get a Joule-Thomson effect, the CO2 expands. So if you're stood next to it, you freeze to death rather than burning to death. CO2 is also heavier than air, so it tends to roll downhill. So it's logical to put your muster points for a safety gathering at the top of the hill so that people just don't get problems. So we understand the tech, and the skills that people are learning are directly applicable. I think in the particular context of hydrogen and its transition, there's an interesting publication produced by the National Grid, the people who run the high pressure national gas transmission system. Their vision of the future is that in the near term, and they don't really define what that is, we will do large scale conversion of gas to hydrogen at the gas terminals and the gas import facilities, because that's where it's most efficient to do it, and we'll then send the carbon dioxide offshore for storage. But a few years later, and perhaps an evolution, these will be the places where large volumes of electricity come onshore from wind, and as a result, we can manufacture hydrogen at those locations. So relying still on the distribution system. But as a general opinion, if you like, for 2050, I don't think the energy system will be anything like as, I'm going to say, simple as we see it today. I think there will be a multiplicity of technologies that have got a place that enable us to achieve net zero, but some of it will be heat pumps, some of it will be better insulation, some of it will be hydrogen, some of it will be electricity on smart grids. Some of it is we might just learn how to walk again.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think there's some key things really that need to happen. And one of those things, and there was a report that came out the past month, which was we think that floating offshore wind, sorry, will be subsidy free by 2030, and that will be a big driver into that move into hydrogen as well. We're seeing turbines now in the wind industry going from sort of 7-8 megawatt. We've got 12 megawatt, 15 megawatt, and we're working towards a 20 megawatt. These are realistic things in not the too distant future in the wind industry.
If I can comment, one of the examples that the government holds up, at the moment, all of these technologies add cost to energy as we know it. But in the offshore wind, particularly the not floating variety, 10 years ago, there were companies installing offshore wind farms. They got very large subsidies, and those continue to today because the initial wind farms were quite expensive to install. But in the most recent offshore licensing round for wind, there are companies bidding for the license and with zero subsidy because the cost of producing the wind offshore has plummeted. And what's happened, to give you an example, what used to be manufacturing wind turbine blades, which was almost like a sculpting art form, there are now factories just churning out the blades. It's brought the cost down dramatically, and suddenly offshore wind is competitive with other forms of electricity without any subsidy. Government, I'm sure, have ambitions for that in floating wind, in blue hydrogen, and in CCS.
Yeah, I know the cost is dramatically different. I think looking around sort of £40 per megawatt hour for fixed bottom wind, and if you compare that with sort of tidal, which is a huge energy resource, potential resource within Scotland, currently that cost is about £300 per megawatt hour. So the difference is absolutely massive. Mark, I just wanted to bring you in. What challenges does the energy network face? Christian had mentioned, and a lot of people have mentioned on the panel, that there is the balancing the energy demand within the supply is going to come from many different sources, and that's got huge implications for the grid. And how are you sort of preparing for that, and what needs to be done to make that not a let's use Texas as an example.
Please, let's not use Texas as an example, Magnus. And I think Texas is something that I was being quite lighthearted there, but it's something that's a very stark reminder of what happens when energy systems fail. And at the end of the day, lives were lost, and that's something that's quite a morbid reminder that in extreme weather environments and points where you rely on your energy system for heating, for cooking, for light, when that isn't there, then there can be very dramatic consequences. And as the system becomes more complex, then we need to be more intelligent about how we maintain the integrity of that system. There's one point I just want to reflect on in terms of our discussions. And I know there are an awful lot of engineers on the call, and I'm a self-confessed engineer, so I kind of have to move past that. But there's huge opportunities for people outside of the engineering profession to support this transition, whether you're an economist, a physicist, a chemist, a psychologist. The scale of the challenge is that there will be opportunities for all to be able to contribute to this. And on the flip side, if you're an engineer and you decide that you don't really want to stay in the engineering sector, Ian, I noticed you missed civil engineering off your list. I don't think we'll go into that into any detail.
It'll still be needed. It's all going to stand on something.
But at the end of the day, from an engineering perspective, like green finance, the regulatory and policy environment, the academic environment, the government institutions, private and public bodies, all of these organizations are going to need people not only with a problem-solving mindset and an attitude towards solving these challenges, but also that kind of get up and go, the willingness to kind of go and face these challenges head on. So I think there's a point here is that, you know, there is a huge engineering challenge that sits around this, but it's not just for engineers to tackle. It's very broad. Looking at the scale of the challenges for the electrical system, you know, for me, it's how do you maintain security of supply? There's a general expectation in, you know, the UK that electricity is freely in, it's there. Like if you go and flip your light switch, it's there. If you go and decide to go and charge a vehicle, it's there. And the system's probably, by the time it averages out, about 99.9% reliable. The chances of you experiencing any kind of interruption to your supply is around once every 2.5 years. And that interruption lasts on average between 20 and 30 minutes. So for that system and that level of complexity, and it's already quite complex, is, you know, a very good standard of service that's delivered. When you get these smart technologies, when people start to make choices, a lot of the optimization that happens just now, how do you decide what system to deploy in what order, is done from a commercial viewpoint, because what minimizes cost to the person that owns the asset or maximizes revenue. There's a new layer that we need to build in as tolerances get tighter, to not only consider the commercial benefit of taking a particular action, whether it is to turn something on or off, whether it is to charge or kind of, you know, vehicle to grid, kind of put your output back into the system. You need to do that not only in a way that is beneficial to the individual, but beneficial to the energy system that it is a part of. And that has a cost attached to it. And that has to be socialized somewhere. Like it's either us as a society or individual groups, but there is an element around the way that we manage day-to-day interactions with our energy system will become more complex, and it can no longer just be free range. It has to be orchestrated with a view to how do you maintain the high level of reliability and security of supply that we expect today going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Some really good points there. I'm just again cautious of the time, but Luca, I just wanted to bring you in. What's the role for the oil and gas energy industry beyond looking at sort of going to 2050? Where are you guys sitting in the energy mix?
I think we lost him.
Oh, has Luca gone?
That was a really tough question, Magnus. I can't believe you asked that. Like, Luca is like, I'm done.
Well, I'm also seeing Thomas here as well.
Yeah,
Luca,
he's back. Yeah.
Luca, very quickly, what's the role for oil and gas going to up to 2050? I know you've mentioned sort of internal combustion engines being thought of into 2070, and then actually we're now looking at hybrids 2032. Very quickly, one minute. What's the future for oil and gas?
The future for oil and gas will be a much lower role than it is today. But you know, oil is still needed as a feedstock for an incredible amount and number of materials and objects that for which it is the best option, even from an environmental perspective. What needs to change is in producing oil, we need to produce oil without emissions from power generation offshore, from flaring, from venting. So it needs to be clean. Just as you look at, you know, where your coffee is coming from or your sugar is coming from, is that from an ethical production, we should start looking at oil in the same way. Is this oil produced in the cleanest possible way, given that we need it, but we don't need the emission associated with it? And then it will be still part of some very hard to decarbonize for a while until we solve air transportation with the hydrogen or other means. You know, but in the long term, I see that oil can become just a mining, like mining steel or mining lithium and cobalt that is needed for battery. One important thing that needs to happen on the oil-based products is recycling, and it is the circular economy. So in addition to the skills of engineering, you know, engineers have been around since Leonardo da Vinci and will always have a strong role in society. But one thing to add is that element of circular economy, how we reuse stuff, how we recycle and bring things into the system and move away from discharging them, which is an issue at the moment, even in renewables. You know, most of the wind blades are going to landfill, and you know, we are part of a project with you guys, OREC NCC looking at a sustainable wind materials exactly in that point.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not something that's immune to the wind industry. Blades are a big issue on the circular economy, and certainly it's a big challenge, and also there's the added complexity that it may increase costs again associated with that. So it's a big challenge, and I don't think we're going to solve it tonight. I don't think we're going to solve any of these issues in 1 hour. It's definitely going to take much longer. I'm looking at sort of my agenda, and we've skipped one thing, but I can see Thomas coming in to ask us some questions. But just very quickly, one liner from everyone. What advice would you give young professionals entering the energy industry? I'm going to go Christian again, just a one-liner.
Be flexible and be ready.
Good. Ian?
I'll echo that, and I will add, and the only person who really cares about your career is you. So focus on what you're enjoying, and if you're not enjoying it, do something different.
Mark?
Don't be too fixed in terms of your destination, because you might blind you to some of the opportunities that come along.
And Luca?
All of the above, plus keep learning. Learning is like breathing. You can't stop it, and you need to keep yourself updated, because it's changing. Everything is changing at a very rapid pace, much than in the past.
Mine would be everything that you've said there, and just continue to go outside your comfort zone, and really take on opportunities. Christian, you got your hand out.
Yes, I forgot to say also, especially for those less represented in the industry, we need more people, more diverse people, and we need more women. For instance, we are we're not a good example of how it should be, but it's kind of the reality of things. So encourage those from diverse backgrounds to join in this big transition.
Yeah, absolutely echo that. Thomas, I can see you waiting there patiently.
It's super interesting, and to be honest, probably listen to you guys talk, all night, and you wouldn't even get to the crux of the base of the problem. But fantastic stuff, really interesting from my perspective, and I'm sure I speak for everyone. It's a shame you guys missed the other talks because we had FemEng. I mean, some of society's talking about what we're doing, but for sure echoing kind of what we've been talking about tonight. So I'm going to try and get through as many of these questions as possible. Obviously, if yours doesn't get answered, there's not much I can do. So just briefly, there's a lot. So if we just try and get through, like I said, really quickly. The first one is just, what is the difference between blue and green hydrogen? Which I believe is...
Very simple answer. The blue is hydrogen manufactured from hydrocarbon, so it has about a 95% reduction in the CO2 emissions, but there are still some small level of emissions. Green refers to hydrogen manufactured by electrolyzing water, so it is genuinely a zero emission hydrogen.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So, Mark, let me see. No? Fantastic. So someone said, in Sweden, a lot of the low emission heating comes from district heating. Is this an option that is explored in Scotland as well, or does that mean too large infrastructure changes or other challenges?
Can I answer that one? It's an excellent question, actually, and I'm a big fan of district heating. I lived in Stockholm for a year during my PhD, and I really enjoyed the experience of having the heating on from October nonstop till April. It was great. There is definitely options for that, and there are some pilots already on being researched, especially in the Central Belt, using former coal mines. You have water there, which is very hot, so you're extracting that as a geothermal heat pump type thing, and you use that as a district heating. So there will be a scope for that. I see it especially on very dense concentrations of population, maybe here in the Central Belt especially, you will see more district heating. And there will be regulation on that coming in the next few years.
But, I mean, there are district heating systems in the UK, but for some reason we've favoured independent heating. But even if you're burning hydrocarbon, it's more efficient.
Yeah.
And increasingly there is pressure through the building regulations to force new housing complexes to do the sort of district heating just to make it more effective.
Fantastic. So we'll just
There's some last one on that, Thomas. I've been thankful that I've designed a number of district heating schemes in the UK, and one of the aspects you have is that there's the right solution for the right problem. So the absolutism is one of the more dangerous things in the energy transition, is that there's space for every solution. And with district heating, one of the interesting things is it actually limits customer choice. So you end up stranded with a capital asset that you end up having to pay for. So, you know, as much as it can be efficient, it actually limits consumer choice, which kind of contradicts some of the market elements that our regulators are very keen on. So there's balance in every solution.
great. So what are your options on moving forward in terms of fuel? Do you see hydrogen, electric, or biofuel powered vehicles replacing petrol and diesel?
So in the near term, I would suggest battery, electric vehicles, because you can get the greatest energy density. I've driven a hydrogen vehicle and it had 2 kilograms of hydrogen in it. It had a range of about 200 kilometers, and I had a 750 bar pressure vessel under the back seat. I think I prefer to be in an electric car. In general, though, the efficiency of fuel cells, it means that it's not a very efficient way of going through the energy cycle. So I think, personal view, electricity or electric for cars, probably hydrogen for trucks, trains, boats.
I think one of the most entertaining analogies I've ever had is, you know, how far could an electric aircraft go? This was asked from a very senior person in Rolls-Royce working on electric aircraft. And his response back to the audience was, how long is your extension cable? So it's, but yeah, anyway.
Yeah. But there will be other fuels for that type of aircraft. So there is some discussion on ammonia, for instance. But yeah, you need to find the right fuel for the right vehicle. Electricity for cars, maybe hydrogen for buses or trains, and aircraft, ammonia or something else.
Okay, I'm going to keep going because there's lots to get through, but we'll see. So for Pale Blue Dot and Blue Hydrogen, do you plan on having 2 CCS technologies, one for post-combustion on gas turbines and a second for pre-combustion for making blue hydrogen?
No, but let me explain. So the CCS piece is a post-combustion capture. So it's an amine plant that will be processing about 8.5 million tons a year of exhaust gas and extracting about 1/3 of a million tons of CO2. In contrast, the hydrogen process is a reformer process. So you put in a lot of steam, a lot of oxygen, get a lot of heat, and you're effectively using temperature to break the molecules down. So you extract the hydrogen. What you get off that plant is about a 50-50 mix of hydrogen and carbon dioxide. You do need to separate those, but you use an amine plant for that as well. So it's not really pre-combustion on the hydrogen, although there is an element of pre-combustion going on, but the main process is to use amine to separate it out.
That's great. Thank you. So another one for Ian. Have you considered using that sequestered CO2 as a fuel in the future?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, the expression CCS suddenly got a U stuck in the middle, which stood for utilization. There is an awful lot of hope that we will find useful ways to use the CO2, and manufacturing fuel is one of them. There are 2 challenges. One is that for many of the applications, the amount of energy required to utilize the CO2 is very high, and it just makes it impractical. The other issue is simply one of scale. At the moment, we are emitting about 36, 37 gigatons of CO2 every year. And in almost every application that I've seen, you just can't use all the CO2. It just swamps the market. So I've no doubt that there will be some developments. I'm aware of some synthetic aviation fuels being made from CO2. So there is potential. I just don't see it as being, if you like, the silver bullet sort of solution.
There are also interesting emerging technologies in reusing that CO2 in the building environment, as construction materials. Then the question becomes as well, that needs to be done in a way that at the end of the useful life of the building, that is disassembled and not destroyed. Otherwise, all that CO2 goes back in the air. Yeah. But there are interesting emerging startup technology and ideas, and I'm sure there will be more for the utilization. That, in my view, I agree with Ian, will be on top, on a side of CCS. CCS will be the predominant way by which we capture that CO2 and store it or sequester it rather than use it.
That's great. I think this will be the last question. So if we consider the main transition opportunities as being in user products and infrastructure, how do we ensure the supply chain to manufacture these user products and the supporting products for infrastructure is developed and retained in Scotland and creates meaningful jobs in Scotland? Additionally, can we utilize this transition to boost rural Scottish economies?
I can maybe kickstart that. So the supply chain within the offshore wind energy, the UK content is very, very low in comparison to countries like Germany. The UK government and the Scottish government are looking to address this and very much are and have invested lots of money at that. It's a huge part of the ORE Catapult's role. So the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, who I work for, is to try and increase UK content, and we do that through engaging with SMEs, so small and medium enterprise businesses. I think tomorrow night at the chain event, my colleague Alex Loudon will be sort of chatting around issues for SMEs, and correct me if I'm wrong on that, Thomas, but that is a huge sort of part of our work. There's programs called the Offshore Wind Growth Partnership, which I'm a part of, which is giving grants and funding to companies of all sizes to try and increase UK content. In regards to rural Scottish economies, I think absolutely they are a big part of the supply chain for offshore wind. I'm thinking around sort of Cromarty Firth, north of Inverness, and looking at fabrication of offshore wind assets. So Global Energy Group is one where they have a massive fabrication yard, which was big during the oil and gas boom years, and they are, I believe, transitioning into offshore renewables, and there's large, across the industry projects that will be looking at that, from sort of Shetland to Orkney all the way down to the Scottish borders and the rest of the UK as well, particularly around Cornwall is another area, and Wales as well, and Pembrokeshire.
It's worth reflecting on, the purpose of our enterprise agencies, so things like local authorities, governments, in terms of their ability to unlock capital and to incentivize people. One of the great things that we have in Scotland is a fantastic skills base in order to rely upon. I think one of the things that we've traditionally been very poor on in the energy sector, especially within the renewable transition, is actually not only having those manufacturing facilities retained within the UK, but also the skill sets that's required. As things move abroad, you get a lot of the fabrication in later parts of the offshore wind rounds went overseas. A lot of wind turbine and component manufacture went outside the UK. And I guess the purpose of those enterprise agencies, skill sets and organizations is to make sure that we either repurpose existing infrastructure and keep it within, we're talking about repurposing automotive plants to potentially produce batteries. You're talking about unlocking other aspects of the economy to address this net zero demand. And I think it's all the groups need to work together to create the right financial and technical skill set framework that these organizations cannot ignore, that ultimately makes us a very attractive place, not only to do business, but to base your business, which is the important thing.
If I can add a word on that, I think that innovation is going to be a key lever for that, right? Because all the technology we mentioned are at the early stages of maturity, and there's still a lot of room to innovate. And that innovation will reduce the cost, will increase the reliability, but also potential for export. The advantage of the Scotland and the North Sea is that it is a mature basin and it is ahead in this transition. So developing the new technology, developing the next generation of technology, and doing that in Scotland is not only a way to have a local content in this transition here, but it's also a way to develop IP and technology that can be exported to other basins and to other regions as they go through the same transition just slightly later. So it's important that we keep the focus on in encouraging and sustaining innovation and encouraging entrepreneurship, so that innovation takes place and grow companies and businesses in Scotland for doing that.
I could perhaps just add one comment, not just a feature of Scotland, but the UK is simply a high labour cost market. And I think it supports what Luca has said. If we will have an advantage if we can develop technologies that, if you like, uses our collective brains, we will never compete on low labor cost mass production sort of activities. So finding clever solutions. I mean, as an example, CCS, horribly expensive, both in capital costs and energy costs. If we could find a way to reduce the cost of that, we'd go a long way to making the energy transition happen. But it's likely that it would be the high value jobs that are what make a difference in Scotland.
That's fantastic. All right, I think we'll end it there. I'll let you guys go. Otherwise, you will just be talking for hours. So.
Well, that's what you wanted.
Well,